The high desert wind came through the canyon at dusk, carrying the smell of sage and dust, and something else. Something that made the animals uneasy. Sarah Mackenzie stood at the fence line of her homestead, watching the light fade from copper to ash, and felt that unease in her own bones. The land had been talking to her for 3 days now, speaking in the language of silence and shadow. And Sarah had learned long ago that when the desert spoke, a wise woman listened. Her homestead sat in a shallow bowl between 2 ridges, protected from the worst of the wind, but exposed in every other way that mattered. 160 acres of hard ground, a cabin that leaked when it rained, a barn that held 2 milk cows and a mule, and a fence that seemed to need mending every other week. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Or it had been hers and Thomas's. Now it was just hers. She touched the worn wedding ring on her finger, a habit that brought no comfort anymore, just acknowledgement. Thomas Mackenzie had been dead for 6 weeks. A rattlesnake in the woodpile, a bite to the hand, fever that took him in 3 days. She'd buried him on the south ridge where he could see the whole valley. He would have liked that. The rifle that had been his leaned against the fence post now, a Winchester 1873, well-maintained, reliable. 44 rounds of ammunition left in the box in the cabin. Thomas had been a careful man. He'd taught her to shoot, to track, to read weather and animal signs. He'd taught her to survive. But he hadn't taught her how to do it alone, and he hadn't taught her what to do when survival demanded choices that had no good answer. Sarah turned back toward the cabin. The sun was nearly gone, and the darkness came fast in the high desert. She needed to feed the animals, close up the barn, bolt the cabin door. The same routine she'd followed every night since Thomas died. The routine that kept her hands busy and her mind from circling the same dark thoughts over and over. She was halfway to the barn when she saw him. At first, she thought it was a shadow, a trick of the failing light. But shadows didn't move like that, didn't stumble and catch themselves on fence posts. Sarah's hand went instinctively to the knife at her belt, her eyes scanning the ridgelines for others. The desert had taught her another lesson. People rarely travelled alone out here unless they had no choice. The figure came closer, moving along the fence line toward the gate. A man, tall but hunched, moving with the careful deliberation of someone in great pain or great weakness. As he neared the gate, the last of the daylight caught his face, and Sarah's breath stopped in her throat. Apache. She knew it from the cut of his clothes, the way his hair was bound, the beadwork visible even in the dim light. He was young, maybe 20, and he was dying. She could see it in the way he moved, the way he held his left side where his shirt was dark with blood. He reached the gate and stopped, one hand on the rough wood for support. For a long moment, they looked at each other across 30 feet of hard-packed earth. His eyes were dark, fever bright, and they held no threat, only desperation. "Water," he said. His English was accented, but clear. "Please." Every instinct Thomas had taught her screamed to refuse, to turn away, to get the rifle and order him off her land. Apache raiders had burned out 3 homesteads in the past month, killed 2 families, stolen livestock and supplies. The territorial government had put a price on Apache scalps. Helping one, giving aid and comfort to the enemy, could get her branded a traitor, could get her killed. But Sarah had been a doctor's daughter before she'd been a rancher's wife. Her father had taught her other lessons, older lessons, about the sanctity of life and the duty of healing. And standing there in the gathering dark, watching a young man bleed to death at her gate, she found that those lessons went deeper than fear. She walked to the well, drew up a bucket, filled the ladle. The young Apache watched her with eyes that expected nothing, hoped for nothing, just waited with the patience of someone who'd already accepted death. That patience, that quiet dignity in the face of the end, decided her. Sarah carried the ladle to the gate, unlatched it, and stepped through. The young man took the water with a hand that shook, drank deeply, then drank again. When he'd emptied the ladle twice, he lowered it and looked at her. "You are kind," he said quietly. "My people will remember." "Your people?" Sarah asked. But he was already turning away, moving back into the gathering darkness with the same careful determination he'd shown approaching. She watched him disappear into the scrub and rock, swallowed by shadows that seemed to rise up to claim him. Sarah stood at the open gate for a long moment, the empty ladle in her hand, and felt the desert's silence press down around her. She'd made a choice. She didn't know if it was the right choice. She only knew that she'd made it, and now she would have to live with whatever consequences followed. She thought that would be the end of it. She was wrong. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of the animals in distress. The cows were lowing, the mule braying, sounds of pure animal fear that brought her bolt upright in bed with her heart hammering. She grabbed her shawl and the Winchester, moving to the window with the practiced silence Thomas had insisted she learn. The first thing she saw was the horses. They lined the eastern ridge, silhouetted against the pre-dawn grey, dozens of them, maybe more. Mounted warriors sat motionless as statues, watching her homestead with the patience of men who'd learned to wait. Sarah's hands tightened on the rifle as she counted. 20, 30, 40. She stopped counting when she reached 50, and there were still more appearing out of the dim light like ghosts made flesh. Her mouth went dry. This wasn't a raiding party. Raiding parties moved fast, struck hard, disappeared. This was something else. This was deliberate. This was a message written in horseflesh and war paint, and the kind of numbers that made resistance meaningless. She scanned the western ridge, then the south. More warriors. Everywhere she looked, more. They'd surrounded her homestead during the night, positioned themselves on every approach, cut off every escape route. And they'd done it so quietly that not even the animals had raised alarm until now. Sarah forced herself to breathe, forced her mind to work through the fear. They hadn't attacked. They'd had all night to burn her out, to take what they wanted, to kill her in her sleep. Instead, they'd waited for daylight, waited for her to see them. That meant something, had to mean something. She dressed quickly, pulling on her work dress and boots, braiding her hair with shaking fingers. The rifle felt heavy in her hands, useless against such numbers, but she kept it anyway. If this was the day she died, she'd die on her feet with a weapon in her hands, same as Thomas would have wanted. Sarah unbolted the cabin door and stepped out into the grey dawn. The cold air hit her face like a slap, carrying the smell of horses and leather and something else. Smoke, maybe, or the dust of many riders. The warriors on the ridges didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just watched. For a long moment, nothing happened. Sarah stood in her yard, rifle in hand, facing an army with nothing but defiance, and the thin hope that if they'd wanted her dead, she'd be dead already. The sun began to rise behind the eastern ridge, turning the sky from grey to pink to gold, and still nothing moved. Then a single rider broke from the group on the northern ridge and began descending toward her homestead. He rode a paint horse, controlled and deliberate, picking his way down the rocky slope with the ease of someone who'd been born in the saddle. As he drew closer, Sarah could see he was older, his face lined with years and weather and command. He wore no war paint, but he didn't need it. Authority radiated from him like heat from stone. He stopped 50 feet from where Sarah stood, dismounted with the fluid grace of a much younger man, and waited. Behind him, more riders appeared, flanking him at a respectful distance. Among them, Sarah saw women, children. This wasn't a war party, it was a tribe, or part of one. The older man raised one hand, palm out, not threatening, not supplicating, just acknowledging her presence, waiting for her response. Sarah lowered the rifle, not dropping it, but angling it toward the ground. A gesture of, not peace, exactly, but not war either. The man nodded once, approving or accepting. Then he spoke, his voice carrying across the space between them with surprising clarity. His words were Apache, fluid and musical, and completely incomprehensible to Sarah. She shook her head, indicating she didn't understand. The man paused, then tried again in heavily accented English. "You give water," he said. It wasn't a question. Sarah's heart lurched. The young man from the gate. They knew. Of course they knew. "Yes," she said, keeping her voice steady. "He was dying. I gave him water." Movement to the man's left. A woman stepped forward, younger, dressed in deerskin decorated with intricate beadwork. She spoke to the older man in rapid Apache, then turned to Sarah. "I am Nasha," she said. Her English was better than the man's, though still accented. "This is my father, Goyakla, chief of our band." She paused, her dark eyes studying Sarah's face. "The man you helped. He is my brother." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not just any warrior, the chief's son. She'd given water to the chief's son, and now the entire tribe was here. The question was, had she saved his life or delayed his death? And which answer would keep her alive? "Is he—" Sarah started, then had to clear her throat. "Is he alive?" Nasha and her father exchanged a look. Then Nasha nodded. "Yes, he lives. Because you gave water when you could have let him die, when you could have killed him and claimed the bounty the white men offer." The words hung in the cold morning air. Sarah hadn't even thought about the bounty, about the $20 the territorial government paid for Apache scalps. But of course they would have thought of it, would have expected it. "I'm not a killer," Sarah said quietly, "and I don't let people die when I can help them." Goyakla spoke again, longer this time, with emphasis on certain words. Nasha listened, then translated, her voice taking on some of her father's formal cadence. "My father says you are a woman alone. He sees no man here, sees no tracks of a man. He asks, 'Where is your husband?'" Sarah's hand tightened on the rifle. "Dead. 6 weeks ago. Snake bite," Nasha translated. Goyakla's expression softened slightly, something that might have been sympathy or understanding crossing his weathered features. He spoke again. "My father says this land is hard for a woman alone. Hard for a man. Harder for a woman. He asks why you stay." "It's my home," Sarah said simply. "Mine and my husband's. I'm not leaving." The translation brought a longer response from Goyakla, followed by what might have been debate between him and Nasha. Finally, Nasha turned back to Sarah. "You gave water to my brother without knowing who he was, without asking for payment, without thought of reward or safety. This is not normal for white settlers. Most would kill first. Take scalp, collect bounty. You are different." Sarah didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Nasha continued, "My father says his people have watched you for 3 days, since my brother returned and told us of the woman who saved his life. We have watched to see what kind of woman you are, to see if you would tell the soldiers where to find us, to see if you would bring men with guns to take revenge for some imagined wrong." 3 days. They'd been watching for 3 days while Sarah went about her work, oblivious to the eyes on the ridges. The thought sent a chill down her spine. "You did none of these things," Nasha said. "You worked your land, you tended your animals, you lived your life. My father says this is a woman of honor." Goyakla spoke again, shorter this time, but with weight behind the words. When he finished, he reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something wrapped in cloth. He walked forward slowly, giving Sarah time to raise the rifle if she chose, but she didn't. When he was 10 feet away, he stopped and held out the bundle. Sarah set the rifle against the fence and walked forward to take it. The cloth was soft deerskin, and inside was a necklace. Beautiful beadwork in blue and white and red, strung on sinew, with a distinctive pattern she didn't recognize but could feel the significance of. "This is mark of protection," Nasha explained. "You wear this Our people know you are friend. They will not harm you. They will not take from you. You are under the protection of Goyakla's band." Sarah looked at the necklace, then at the chief, then at the hundreds of warriors and families watching from the ridges. Protection. But protection came with a price. Always. The question was, what price? "What do you want from me?" she asked. Nasha translated the question. Goyakla's response was brief. "Nothing," Nasha said. "This is gift, payment of debt, my brother's life, for your safety. That is all." But Sarah had lived on the frontier long enough to know that nothing was ever that simple. "If I wear this, and other settlers see it, they'll think I'm a traitor. They'll think I'm helping you raid, hiding you from the army. They might kill me for it." Nasha translated, and Goyakla nodded slowly. He spoke again, longer this time, and Nasha's translation came with clear respect in her voice. "My father says yes. This is true. White men will not understand. They will see only Apache beads and think enemy. You must choose. Protection from us, danger from them. Or danger from us, protection from them. You cannot have both." Sarah looked down at the necklace in her hands. The beadwork was exquisite. The craftsmanship, as fine as anything she'd ever seen. It represented safety from an enemy that had burned out neighboring homesteads. But it also represented becoming an enemy herself in the eyes of her own people. She thought about Thomas, about what he would have wanted. Thomas had been practical, strategic. He would have told her to refuse, to stay neutral, to survive without taking sides. But Thomas was dead, and Sarah was alone, and the choice was hers to make. She thought about the young warrior at her gate, fever bright and dying, and how she'd given him water without thinking, without calculating, without considering consequences. She'd done it because it was right, because in that moment he hadn't been Apache or enemy or stranger. He'd been a person in need, and she'd had the means to help. If she refused the necklace now, she'd be choosing a different path, a path that said her kindness had conditions, that her humanity extended only as far as safety allowed. And Sarah had been a doctor's daughter before she'd been a frontier wife. Some lessons went deeper than survival. She put the necklace over her head. The beadwork settled against her chest, cool and smooth, and surprisingly heavy. Final. Goyakla's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. Approval, maybe, or acknowledgement. He placed one hand briefly over his heart, a gesture that needed no translation, then turned and walked back to his horse. Nasha lingered a moment longer. "You are brave," she said quietly, "or foolish. Perhaps both." "Just trying to do what's right," Sarah said. "Right is not always the same as safe." Nasha glanced at the necklace. "My brother wishes to thank you himself. When he is stronger, he will come. With my father's permission, if you allow." Sarah nodded. "He's welcome here." Nasha smiled, a brief flash of warmth that transformed her serious face. Then she, too, turned and walked to her horse. Within minutes, the warriors on the ridges began to pull back, disappearing into the landscape as silently as they'd appeared. Sarah stood in her yard and watched them go, the necklace heavy around her neck, and wondered what she'd just set in motion. The sun climbed higher, the desert fell silent, and Sarah Mackenzie went about the business of her day, feeding animals and mending fence and working her land, with Apache beads against her heart, and the certain knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Sarah fell into her routines, hyper-aware of the necklace she wore, but seeing no sign of Apache presence. The animals settled, the land quieted, and she began to wonder if perhaps the whole thing had been a strange dream, born of grief and isolation. Then, on a Tuesday morning, she saw the dust. Riders coming from the south, moving fast. 6 of them, maybe 7. Sarah's stomach tightened. Settlers, from the look of them. Probably from the territorial militia that had been sweeping the region, hunting Apache bands, and she was standing in her yard wearing Apache protection beads. She had maybe 10 minutes before they arrived. 10 minutes to decide whether to hide the necklace or face whatever came. Sarah's hand went to the beadwork, felt its weight, and made her choice. She'd chosen this path. She wouldn't hide from it. The riders thundered into her yard in a cloud of dust and horse sweat, pulling up hard in front of her cabin. The lead rider was a man in his 40s, thick-bearded, with the hard eyes of someone who'd seen too much frontier violence. His gaze went immediately to the necklace at Sarah's throat, and his expression darkened. "Ma'am," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I'm Captain Wade Hollister of the Territorial Militia. Mind telling me where you got those beads?" Sarah lifted her chin. "They were a gift." "A gift?" Hollister spat into the dirt. "From who?" "From people I helped." Another rider pushed forward, younger, maybe 25, with the kind of eagerness that made Sarah nervous. "She's wearing Apache colors, Captain. That makes her a collaborator. Probably been giving them information, helping them plan raids." "That's not true," Sarah said firmly. "I haven't helped anyone raid anything." "But you helped Apache," Hollister said. It wasn't a question. Sarah held his gaze. "I gave water to a dying man. That's all." "That's all?" The young rider laughed harshly. "Apache burned out the Morrison place last week, killed Jim Morrison and his 2 boys, left his wife barely alive. You're giving them water while they're murdering white families." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She'd heard about the Morrison raid, heard the stories whispered in town, but hearing it said directly, being accused of complicity, made her sick. "The man I helped didn't burn anyone out," Sarah said quietly. "He was wounded, alone, dying. I gave him water. That's not a crime." "It is when you're aiding the enemy," Hollister said. He dismounted, walked closer. His hand rested on the revolver at his hip, not threatening, but visible. "Mrs. Mackenzie, isn't it? I heard about your husband. I'm sorry for your loss. But you need to understand the situation you're in." "I understand it fine." "Do you?" Hollister gestured at the necklace. "You're wearing their mark. Every settler for 50 miles is going to see that and think you're one of them. They're going to think you're feeding them information, hiding them, maybe even helping them plan attacks. And when the next homestead gets burned, when the next family dies, they're going to blame you." Sarah felt the weight of his words, the truth in them. She'd known this would be the consequence, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that thinking about it hadn't. "I'm not helping anyone attack anyone," she said. "I'm just trying to live my life." "Can't do that while wearing Apache beads," the young rider said. "You're either with us or against us." "That's not—" Sarah started, but Hollister cut her off. "He's right, Mrs. Mackenzie. There's no middle ground out here. Not anymore. Apache have been raiding too hard, killing too many. People are scared, and scared people don't think straight. They see those beads. They're going to see a traitor." Sarah touched the necklace. "So what are you asking me to do?" "Take it off," Hollister said bluntly. "Take it off, and we'll forget we saw it. We'll tell people you were threatened, forced to wear it. No shame in that." "And if I don't?" Hollister's expression hardened. "Then we can't protect you. Next time militia comes through and sees you wearing enemy colors, they might not be as understanding as we are." It was a threat wrapped in concern, and they both knew it. Sarah looked at the 6 armed men in her yard, at the hard certainty in their faces, and felt the trap close around her. She could take off the necklace, deny the choice she'd made, go back to being just another widow trying to survive. Or she could keep it, accept the consequences, and trust that the protection it offered would be worth the danger it invited. Before she could answer, movement caught her eye. On the northern ridge, just visible in the morning light, a single rider sat motionless, watching. Sarah couldn't make out details at this distance, but she knew. Apache. They were still watching, still waiting to see what kind of woman she was. The choice crystallized in that moment. If she took off the necklace now, under threat from these men, she'd be proving that her kindness had limits, that her principles bent when pressure came. And Sarah had learned from her father, from Thomas, from life on the frontier, that the moment you started compromising principles, you lost something essential, something that couldn't be bought back. "No," she said quietly. Hollister's eyes narrowed. "No, I'm not taking it off. I earned this. I saved a man's life, and his people honored that. I'm not going to dishonor it now because other people don't understand." The young rider reached for his rifle. "Captain, she just admitted—" "Stand down, Mitchell," Hollister ordered, his hand coming up in a sharp gesture. He studied Sarah for a long moment, and she saw something in his expression shift. Respect, maybe, or understanding. "You're a stubborn woman, Mrs. Mackenzie." "I'm a woman who keeps her word," Sarah said. Hollister glanced at the ridge where the Apache rider sat, then back at Sarah. "You know what you're doing? You know what this means?" "Yes." He nodded slowly, then walked back to his horse and mounted. "All right, we'll leave you be. But understand this. Next group that comes through might not be as patient. Might not ask questions before they start shooting. You're putting yourself in danger." "I'm aware of that." "And you're doing it anyway?" Sarah touched the necklace again, feeling the beads warm from her skin. "I'm doing it anyway." Hollister shook his head, something between admiration and disbelief in his expression. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, or the most foolish. I hope for your sake it's the former." He turned his horse. "Let's ride, men." The young rider, Mitchell, looked like he wanted to protest, but Hollister's glare silenced him. Within minutes, they were gone, dust settling in their wake, and Sarah was alone again in her yard. Except she wasn't alone. The rider on the ridge remained, a silent sentinel. Sarah raised one hand in acknowledgement, not quite a wave, just recognition. The rider raised a hand in return, then turned and disappeared over the ridge. Sarah stood in the morning sun, Apache beads against her heart, and felt the full weight of her choice settle onto her shoulders. She'd chosen a side, not the side of Apache against settlers or settlers against Apache. She'd chosen the side of humanity, of kindness, of doing what was right regardless of consequences. Now she would have to live with whatever those consequences turned out to be. 3 days later, they came back. Sarah was in the barn milking the cows in the pre-dawn dark when she heard the horses. Multiple horses, moving at a walk, deliberate and controlled. Her heart jumped into her throat, and she grabbed the rifle she now kept close at all times, moving to the barn door. Riders approached from the east, silhouetted against the rising sun. Not militia this time. Apache. Sarah counted 5 of them, riding in a loose formation that suggested purpose rather than threat. As they drew closer, she recognized Nasha on a grey mare, and beside her the young warrior she'd given water to. He sat his horse well, moving without the careful pain of before, recovered, or mostly so. They stopped at the fence and Nasha called out, "Sarah Mackenzie, may we approach?" Sarah lowered the rifle and walked to the gate. "You may." They dismounted, all 5 of them, and approached on foot. The young warrior she'd helped walked in front, and Sarah got her first good look at him in daylight. He was indeed young, maybe 20, with intelligent eyes and a scar on his left cheekbone that looked recent. He stopped 10 feet from her and spoke in Apache, then waited while Nasha translated. "My brother says he owes you his life. He was wounded in a fight with prospectors who tried to claim water that has belonged to our people for generations. He was shot and he bled for 2 days before he found your homestead. Without the water you gave, he would have died." Sarah looked at the young man. "I'm glad you survived." He spoke again, and Nasha translated. "He says he has brought you gifts, payment for the debt he owes." One of the other warriors stepped forward, carrying bundles wrapped in hide. He set them on the ground in front of Sarah and stepped back. Sarah knelt and unwrapped the first bundle. Inside were dried meats, expertly prepared, and what looked like pemmican. Enough food to last her weeks. The second bundle held deerskins, tanned and soft, perfect for winter clothing. The third held herbs and medicinal plants, carefully bundled and labelled with marks she didn't understand but could guess at. Medicine. Real medicine, not the poor substitutes she'd been making do with. "This is too much," Sarah said quietly. Nasha translated the young warrior's response. "He says, it is not enough. You gave life. These things are only survival." Sarah looked at the gifts, then at the 5 Apache standing in her yard, and felt something shift in her understanding. These weren't enemies. They were people, with their own codes of honor, their own sense of debt and payment. They'd come to thank her, to pay her back, to acknowledge the simple kindness she'd shown. "Tell him thank you," Sarah said. "Tell him I'm honored." Nasha translated, and the young warrior's serious face broke into a smile. He spoke again, longer this time, and Nasha's translation came with a note of something Sarah couldn't quite identify. Warning, maybe, or concern. He says, "White soldiers are coming, a large group, with wagons and supplies. They are building a fort 3 days' ride south, on land that was promised to our people in treaty. When the fort is finished, they will send patrols through this valley. They will see you wearing our mark. They will think you are enemy." Sarah had heard rumors of a new fort being built, but rumors were common on the frontier. This sounded more certain. "When?" "2 weeks, maybe less. My brother says—" Nasha paused, choosing her words carefully. "He says you should leave. Go to a town. Find safety with your own people. This valley will become battleground. It is not safe for a woman alone." Sarah looked around at her homestead. The cabin Thomas had built with his own hands, the barn they'd raised together, board by board, the fence line they'd walked 100 times, the grave on the south ridge where she'd buried the man she loved. "No," she said quietly. "This is my home. I'm not leaving." Nasha translated, and the young warrior's expression grew troubled. He spoke rapidly, gesturing at the ridges, the valley, the homestead itself. Nasha translated with clear reluctance. "He says, you are brave but foolish. When the soldiers come, when the fighting starts, being brave will not save you. Neither will our protection. A bullet does not care about honor or beads or debts paid." "I understand the risks," Sarah said, "but I'm staying." The young warrior and Nasha exchanged a long look. Then Nasha sighed and spoke without translating first. "You are like my father, stubborn beyond reason. He says this is both your greatest strength and your greatest weakness." "Probably true," Sarah admitted. Nasha smiled slightly, then grew serious. "Sarah Mackenzie, my people are leaving this valley, moving north to lands the white government has not yet claimed. We will be gone before the soldiers arrive. You will be alone when they come." Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. She'd gotten used to the watchers on the ridges, the knowledge that Goyakla's band was out there somewhere keeping an eye on the woman who wore their mark. The thought of them leaving, of being truly alone again, was more frightening than she wanted to admit. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow, at dawn." Nasha paused. "You could come with us." The offer hung in the air between them, unexpected and impossible and tempting in ways Sarah hadn't anticipated. To leave this all behind, to go somewhere new, to be part of something larger than one woman and one homestead and one endless struggle against the desert. But it was impossible for 100 reasons. She was white. They were Apache. She knew nothing of their ways, their language, their life. She would be a burden, an outsider, a reminder of everything they were fleeing. And more than that, she was Thomas's widow, and this was Thomas's land, and some debts couldn't be paid by running away. "No," Sarah said gently, "but thank you for everything." The young warrior spoke one last time, and Nasha's translation came soft and sad. He says he will remember the woman who gave water when she could have let him die. He will tell his children of your kindness. Your name will live in our stories. Sarah felt her throat tighten. Tell him I'll remember him too, all of you. They left shortly after, mounting their horses and riding north without looking back. Sarah stood in her yard and watched them go, the bundles of gifts at her feet, and felt the loneliness of the desert settle around her like a familiar coat. The next morning she woke before dawn and climbed to the south ridge where Thomas was buried. From there she could see the entire valley, and beyond it, the northern ridges, where Goyakla's band had been camped. As the sun rose, she saw them moving out, a long line of people and horses and travois loaded with their lives. Hundreds of them, maybe more, leaving the land their ancestors had walked for generations. Sarah watched until the last of them disappeared over the northern ridge. Then she touched the beads at her throat, whispered a prayer for their safety, and walked back down to her homestead to face whatever came next. The soldiers arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks later. Sarah was splitting wood when she saw the dust, a long column of it rising from the southern trail. She set down the axe, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked to the fence to wait. The rifle leaned against a post within easy reach, but she didn't pick it up. No point. If they meant to kill her, a rifle wouldn't change that. They came in formation, disciplined and organized. 24 cavalry soldiers, led by an officer on a tall bay horse. They pulled up at her fence and the officer dismounted and walked forward. He was young, maybe 30, with the kind of clean-shaven face that said he hadn't been on the frontier long. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat brim. "Lieutenant James Warren, United States Cavalry. This your homestead?" "Yes." His eyes went to the necklace at her throat, and his expression changed. Not anger, exactly. More like confusion mixed with concern. "Ma'am, I need to ask you about those beads you're wearing." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "What do you want to know?" "Where did you get them?" "They were a gift. From Apache, I helped." A murmur ran through the soldiers behind him. Warren held up a hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "You helped Apache? When? How?" "Few weeks ago, a young warrior came to my homestead, wounded and dying. I gave him water. Later, his tribe came to thank me. They gave me this." She touched the necklace. "It's a mark of protection." Warren studied her for a long moment. "Mrs. Mackenzie. Sarah Mackenzie. Mrs. Mackenzie, you understand that giving aid to hostile Apache is considered treason, that you could be arrested for what you've just described?" Sarah felt her heart rate spike but kept her voice calm. "I understand that giving water to a dying man is considered human decency. I also understand that some people see it differently." One of the soldiers behind Warren spoke up, his voice harsh. "Lieutenant, she's admitted to helping the enemy. We should arrest her, bring her back to the fort for trial." Warren didn't take his eyes off Sarah. "Tell me something, Mrs. Mackenzie. Where's your husband?" "Dead. 6 weeks ago. Snake bite." "So you've been running this homestead alone? For 6 weeks?" "Yes." "And in that time, has your homestead been raided? Has anything been stolen, burned, or destroyed?" Sarah saw where he was going. "No. Nothing." "Interesting." Warren walked closer to the fence, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I've been assigned to this territory for 3 months now. In that time, I've seen 12 homesteads burned, 24 people killed. But your place sits here, untouched, alone, vulnerable. And you're wearing Apache protection beads. You want to tell me what that means?" Sarah chose her words carefully. "It means I did the right thing when I had the chance. And they honored that." "The right thing," Warren repeated. He glanced back at his men, then at Sarah. "Mrs. Mackenzie, I could arrest you right now, take you back to the fort, let a military tribunal decide whether your right thing was treason or not. But I'm not going to do that." Sarah felt a rush of relief, quickly tempered by Warren's next words. However, I am going to give you a choice. You can take off those beads, renounce any association with Apache hostiles, and we'll leave you be. Or you can keep wearing them, and the next patrol that comes through might not be as lenient. Your choice. The same choice Hollister had offered. The same ultimatum. And Sarah's answer was the same. No, she said quietly. I'm not taking them off. Warren's expression flickered between frustration and something that might have been respect. You're a stubborn woman, Mrs. Mackenzie. So I've been told. You know what you're risking? Yes. He studied her for another long moment, then nodded slowly. All right. I'll note in my report that you were threatened by Apache, forced to wear their mark for your own protection. That should keep other patrols from bothering you. Sarah blinked. You'd lie in your report? I'd offer an interpretation of events that protects a widow trying to survive on the frontier, Warren said carefully. There's a difference. Why? Warren glanced at the homestead, at the neat cabin and well-maintained barn, and the grave on the south ridge. Because I've seen what this land does to people, Mrs. Mackenzie. I've seen good men become monsters and monsters become heroes. I've seen enough grey area to know that right and wrong aren't always what the government says they are. He paused. And because my mother was widowed young, and she survived alone for years before my father found her, I know what kind of strength that takes. Sarah felt her throat tighten. Thank you, Lieutenant. Don't thank me. Just be careful. And maybe, when you can, consider moving closer to town. For your own safety. I'll consider it, Sarah said, knowing she wouldn't. Warren nodded, mounted his horse, and raised his hand to signal the column forward. As they rode past, several soldiers stared at Sarah with open hostility, but they kept riding. Within minutes, they were gone, swallowed by the southern trail. Sarah stood at her fence for a long time after, touching the beads at her throat, and thought about the choices she'd made, about the young warrior she'd given water to, about Goyakla and Nasha and the tribe that had honored her kindness, about Hollister and Warren and the men who'd threatened and the men who'd protected. The frontier was full of hard choices and harder consequences. But Sarah had been a doctor's daughter before she'd been a rancher's wife, and she'd learned long ago that some principles were worth defending, regardless of cost. Winter came to the high desert, bringing cold winds and thin snow that didn't last. Sarah winterized the cabin, laid in supplies, prepared for the isolation that the season would bring. The beads stayed around her neck, visible to anyone who came close enough to see. Patrols came through occasionally, always led by Warren, who kept his word about the reports. Settlers passed by on the trail to the south, some staring at her necklace with suspicion, others ignoring it entirely. Sarah kept to herself, worked her land, survived. Spring arrived with wildflowers and the return of green to the valley. Sarah was planting when she heard the horse, a single rider, approaching from the north. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and felt her heart jump. Nasha rode down from the ridge on her grey mare, alone. She stopped at the fence and dismounted, and Sarah walked to meet her. "You're still here," Nasha said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm still here," Sarah confirmed. "We heard soldiers came. We heard they tried to arrest you." "They tried. I'm still here." Nasha smiled, that brief flash of warmth that transformed her serious face. "My father was right about you, stubborn beyond reason." She reached into a pouch at her belt and pulled out something small, wrapped in cloth. "My brother wanted you to have this. He made it himself, over the winter." Sarah unwrapped the cloth and found a small carving. A woman, carved from wood, standing tall with her arms at her sides. Simple, but beautifully done, capturing something essential about strength and stubbornness and survival. "Tell him it's beautiful," Sarah said quietly. "Tell him yourself," Nasha said. "We're camped 2 days north. Good land, good water. If you ever need help, or if you get tired of being alone, you're welcome there. Sarah looked at the carving, then at Nasha. How did you know I'd still be here? Because you're like my father, like my brother, like all of us who refuse to leave the places we love, even when staying means danger. Nasha paused. That necklace you wear, it marks you as one of us. Not Apache, but family, chosen family. Do you understand? Sarah touched the beads, felt their familiar weight. Yes, I understand. Nasha mounted her horse, then looked down at Sarah one last time. The soldiers will come back, more of them with orders to clear this valley. When they do, remember, you are not alone. We watch, we remember. She rode north without looking back, disappearing into the landscape like smoke. Sarah stood in her yard, holding the wooden carving, and felt something settle in her chest. Peace, maybe, or acceptance. She'd made her choice weeks ago, standing in this same yard with water in her hand and a dying man at her gate. Everything since had been consequences, reactions, the world responding to that one simple act of kindness. But she'd do it again, without hesitation, without question. Because Sarah Mackenzie had been a doctor's daughter before she'd been a rancher's wife, and some lessons went deeper than fear, deeper than survival, deeper than the hard calculations of frontier life. She walked to the south ridge and stood at Thomas's grave, the wooden carving in one hand and the other touching the beads at her throat. I'm still here, she said to the wind, to the grave, to the memory of the man who'd taught her to survive. And I'm going to stay. The desert wind carried her words away into the vast silence of the valley. And somewhere to the north, in lands the government hadn't yet claimed, an Apache tribe carried the story of a widow who gave water when she could have given death, who chose kindness when kindness was dangerous, who wore their mark even when wearing it could get her killed. Sarah Mackenzie's name would live in their stories, and she would live in this valley, on this land, in this place she and Thomas had built together. Alone, but not alone. Vulnerable, but protected. Stubborn beyond reason. Brave beyond measure. The sun climbed higher, the day stretched ahead, and Sarah went back to her work, Apache beads against her heart, and lived.